Hi everybody, I'm Benji Wall, and this is the Urban White-tailed Deer in Urban Areas public workshop, led by Jessica Merkling. Take over, come.
Hi, I'm Jessica Merkling. I recognize some faces from the beaver talk I did a little bit ago, but today we're going to talk about white-tailed deer. For those who weren't here and don't already know me, I'm Jessica Merkling. I'm the urban wildlife biologist for the Department of Natural Resources. I work inside the Division of Fish and Wildlife, and that's important because people just assume DNR and that I'm law enforcement and I work for state parks. I'm neither one of those things. So the Department of Natural Resources has 11 separate divisions in it, so I fall under the Division of Fish and Wildlife, and that will actually come up later. Thanks for having me here today. It sounds like there's a lot of conversation about deer habitat in urban areas. I suspect maybe some information coming from like the recent EHD event, so there's a lot of complexities around deer. So we're going to try to talk about all those today. There's a lot of information. I'm usually pretty loud, but if I'm too fast, feel free to slow me down. They said it's a jam-packed presentation, probably like the beaver one, but we'll see how it goes. There should be time at the end for questions. If not, feel free to raise your hand and ask a question. It doesn't bother me. So today we're going to talk about life history, some of the diseases that are in current discussions right now, some deer management, habitat, and then rules and regulations surrounding deer. So for the life history, and I will say, usually in life history we have a description of white-tailed deer, but I guess I would poll the room, does anyone not know what a white-tailed deer looks like? Or has any questions about identifying a white-tailed deer? Okay. I don't have that in the presentation, but I'm happy to talk about that for anyone who may want me to cover. So the bottom line for white-tailed deer, so we'll get into it, is that they are actually a conservation success story. So in 1893, the last wild deer in Indiana was killed down in Knox County. Deer were extirpated from the state of Indiana due to things like unregulated hunting and then habitat destruction. It's where most of our wildlife that we've reintroduced, that's usually their plight, is the hunting and the habitat destruction. The number one reason we're losing wildlife across the globe is because of habitat loss. So that's where we'll probably spend a good chunk of our time, but just something to keep in mind. From 1934 to 1942, we started reintroducing deer in Indiana. We purchased deer from Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina. And then by the 1943, we thought we had about a population of about 900 deer. Then we had our first deer hunting season in November in 1951. It was open for 3 days, and there was a 13% success rate. From what I can tell, I didn't go to the deer biologist because I ran out of time to. Today's success rate is about 35%. I believe from what I found, like I said, I haven't conferred this with the deer biologist, that our goal is about 20% success rate, so still quite a bit higher than what it used to be. And then for the next 2 years, in 53 to 55, we actually started having more deer released statewide. And then in 56, we actually started doing the trapping and relocation program within Indiana that began with about 500 deer. So then by 1957, we had about 9,000 deer. In 1985, we had increased about 32,000 deer, or excuse me, for harvest, exceeding harvest. And then the last year's totals as of the current dashboard, as of Friday, the current deer harvest from this last season was 126,183 deer. So we've definitely improved these number of deer. So this is one of the most successful reintroductions in Indiana. Most of that success and the funding for that success comes from the sale of hunting and fishing licenses and trapping licenses from that Pittman Robertson and Denjel Johnson Wildlife and Sport Fish Restoration Grant. I can never say that. And deer are one of Indiana's most valuable resources. As of 2018, we are one of the top 10 states for deer hunting, white-tailed deer hunting. A couple years ago, we were actually in the top 2. White-tailed deer in Indiana bring in over $300 million annually, and it supports over 1,600 jobs in the state of Indiana alone for white-tailed deer. So it's a very valuable resource. If you haven't guessed, it's our big money maker for license sales. So white-tailed deer biology, the biggest thing with deer is that they're extremely adaptable. They thrive in rural and urban environments. we are frequently creating new habitat for them, especially around urban spaces because they are an edge species. So an edge species just means they thrive in areas where different types of habitat come together. So if you have a suburban like HOA development next to a cornfield, next to a little plot of woodland, that's where they're gonna thrive. So a lot of times when we think of like expansion and urbanization, we're thinking we're taking away habitat. In some cases, like with the deer, we're actually creating more habitat. Deer have extremely high reproductive success. They will eat almost any plant under the right conditions. We are going to eventually talk about plants less preferred by deer, but that doesn't mean never eaten. And they're also pretty adaptable with their diets as well. In the spring and summer, they have some of that egg. They have some of those wildflowers and grasses that they feed on. Then in the fall, they move to that hard and soft mass from like acorns and things like that. And then they have even more grasses and egg waste typically in the winter. For their reproduction, the mating for deer begins around mid-October. It usually peaks early in November. My dad swears his favorite time to hunt is that first week of November because that's when like their peak rut. And then that mating season lasts through December, sometimes into January. Does will give birth to 1 to 3 fawns each year. They're typically born in May and June, and then they can become reproductively active by that December. So that's how quickly they can start giving birth into the population. Does also remain reproductive throughout their life. It is very common for mother deer to leave fawns in different areas. So this could be in your yard, it could be in a park, landscaping. Typically when they're having fawning cover, the dominant of the chain got the first pick, and then as you go down the line, you get less and less good habitat for where you're having your fawns. So that's why you might start seeing fawns in more open areas. Not ideal, but that's what typically happens. Fawns very frequently hide by themselves and they stay motionless, and that's how they stay safe while mom is away. This is not unique to deer. This is how most baby wildlife survive. They're typically senseless and they're told, I don't know if your mom can actually say that as a deer, but they're basically expected to lay there and keep really, really still, and that's how they avoid predators while mom has to go off and like keep her nutrition up for feeding baby. If you find a fawn, the best thing you can do is leave the area. That includes your pets. Usually if you have to like put something back that doesn't actually deter mom from coming back, the biggest thing is that you're putting your scent or your pet scent on that area, and that's attracting that fawn down to predators. That's the bigger issue. Like I said, that's consistent for most wildlife. Don't intervene unless you are absolutely sure the fawn is truly injured or orphaned. Signs would be like you actively saw mom die. If you see things like difficulty breathing, excessive diarrhea, visibly open wounds, that type of thing. But I would caution to make sure you know what you're seeing before you get involved. Don't feed or move the fawn. She'll usually come back. It is unlawful to keep a deer without proper permits. The only people allowed to have deer for this type of rehab or type situation are permitted wildlife rehabbers. Everything else is illegal. While it may be well-intentioned, we have a lot of cases where people take in a deer and then these deer are like 3 years old and they're still like tiny little fawns. They're not getting the right nutrition. So the permitted wildlife rehabbers, their facilities have to be inspected. There's certain species they can and cannot house together. There's a lot of training that goes into it. So the best thing is just to let fawns be. It can be really difficult to find a rehabber, and as difficult as it may be, sometimes it is best just to let nature take its course. Even though we don't see it every day, wildlife dies. It's not fun, it's not pleasant, but that's a lot of things that happen. I try to speak about the value of an animal dying. There is value in that. There is a lot of other wildlife, insects and things like that that actually need that nutrition from deceased animals. So there is value in that too, even though it's not fun or pleasant to watch. So in addition to being really reproductive, they have a lot of other circumstances that enable them to proliferate, specifically in urban and more rural environments. One of those things is because there's often a lot of perceived safety concerns about hunting, especially in an urban area. I say perceived because there's like the actual things that were really happening, and there's things that people think may happen. So some people say, well, they're going to shoot my dog, they're going to shoot kids on the way to school, all these things come up. So if you're thinking about deer management, these are things that you're going to want to talk to the community about, like what are they fearful of, right? There also may be local ordinances that may prohibit dispatching firearms and or other projectiles, and that will come back at the very end of this presentation. There's a lot of concerns about liability, public relations concerning deer management, excuse me, and there's availability of habitat, and then, like we said, in those urban areas, there's just all this habitat that's constantly being added to. And there's not a lot of predators in Indiana at all, but there's a lot of predators in general, specifically in those urban areas. And we have a lot of benefits of a healthy deer herd, right? It's a sign of a healthy ecosystem. If it's a healthy deer herd, there's usually less human-wildlife conflicts. There's increased recreational opportunity. We talked about they are a really valuable resource in the state of Indiana. And if you have a healthy deer herd, then you're meeting those social carrying capacity goals for people. But with all the deer, sometimes there are concerns that come up. So property damage, so people really don't like it when they eat certain ornamental plants or their gardens, browse lines, and then those can all have environmental impacts too, even if it's not just in the backyard. So state parks might have some state endangered or threatened species. If you have deer that are heavily browsing in an area, you can actually be contributing to the spread of invasive species. So for example, garlic mustard, how many of you pulled some? Yeah. So garlic mustard is actually not preferred by deer. So what they'll do is they'll eat around it, they'll eat the plants around it. And when there is a disturbed site, that makes it easier for invasive species to spread. So then the garlic mustard gets bigger. And then garlic mustard is also allelopathic. So like all that combined just helps spread garlic mustard. And then it's overall ecosystem decline. So, you know, it can take years for forests to recover from all that. I'm probably talking to Aaron like, hey, how have your trees recovered from the deer damage, right? Or there's, you know, ground cover that provides nesting for other wildlife, other bird species, so all those things can be a factor. Deer vehicle collisions. How many of you have hit a deer or know someone who's hit a deer? Yeah, I'd be very shocked if nobody raised their hand, right? So that's a concern. Human health concerns and deer health concerns predominantly circle around some of those diseases that we're going to talk about really briefly. So I'm going to highlight again, I am not the deer health expert. If you have very specific questions, let me know. I'd be happy to put you in contact with her or the deer biologist. I'm just going to cover this because it's coming up a lot now because we did have a recent EHD event. So just give me like the very brief information that you can find on our website. If you have more in-depth questions, just let me know and I'll get you in contact with the right person. So the first disease that's probably fresh in our mind is the episodic hemorrhagic disease, or EHD. It's often confused with blue tongue. It's actually a separate disease from that. It's a virus that spreads between deer and a biting midge. So in those drought years where it's more buggy, that's when you have more outbreaks. And you, like with all wildlife, it's a cyclical event. So typically you have severe outbreaks every 5 to 10 years. In July 24, we received reports in Wabash County, and then eventually reports spread to other counties, mostly in the northern third of the state. I was on maternity leave, so I didn't have to do testing, but it is more involved to test for EHD. Typically, you need fresh samples of the spleen, the liver, the kidney, and blood, so it's a little bit more involved in sampling. We do have an EHD website, or dashboard on our website, and this is the one as of Friday. And essentially, a lot of people were asking me with this EHD outbreak, what can we do to help the deer? What's going to happen to the population because we have this outbreak? The honest answer is we're still processing the data as of April this year. I have April 24, but it's supposed to be April 25. But we're still processing all this data. We don't even know if EHD has actually impacted the herd. So what's going to happen is they're going to look at the data. If it shows significant population effects due to EHD, that's when we'll make recommendations for either bonus antlerless or deer quotas, those types of things. In Elkhart County, there's 20 reports of EHD and there's 41 dead deer. And at this time, Elkhart's not one of the counties that was affected enough to potentially even do anything different about harvest for this next upcoming season. The other disease that is probably a little more known, or at least more talked about recently, I know, it kind of depends. There's pockets of who talks about what. It's hard to tell. It's chronic wasting disease, or CWD. It's a fatal infectious disease that affects the nervous system and essentially abnormal prions, which is a type of protein, damages the brain and nervous system. It is contagious and it spreads through things like direct contact, contaminated environments, and bodily fluids. This includes like afterbirth for fawns and things like that. So in this dark green northeast corner, fawns within that corner now cannot be moved outside of that area if they need a rehabber. So this is another example of why we tend to leave fawns alone. Shed prions can actually persist in the environment for many years. So if a deer has one misfolded protein, it has CWD. That's how it is. It is actually very rare to see external signs of CWD in a deer because most of the deer die before you'll see some of these signs. But if you're going to look for them, probably drastic weight loss, change in behaviors, drooling, difficulty walking or standing, excessive thirst, excessive urination, or weakness over time. Problem with this is like most of the description of any wildlife disease for any wildlife. So it's really hard to tell unless you're actively sampling. In April 24, the first positive adult male was harvested in LaGrange County. And then as of February 2025, we had a second positive down in Posey County. There is no effective cure or vaccine for CWD. Only sampled lymph nodes can determine the presence of CWD. We do have a process for that. There are no current reports of CWD in humans, but it is uncertain if people can be infected. So as a precaution, DNR alone, the CDC recommends that if you're going to harvest a deer to have it tested, and that if you do have a positive deer, you should not eat that meat. So that's the biggest recommendation. And to prevent the spread of these two diseases and any other disease, we shouldn't be feeding deer. Opting for synthetic lures instead of urine-based lures, if that's what your thing is. Using legal hunting as a tool to reduce the deer herd and contact, providing habitat, not food, and then again, leaving fawns be. Those are the best ways that we can help actually spread disease. A lot of people want to run to like feed the deer, but that's usually not, while it's well intentioned, it's usually not as helpful as people want it to be. So now we're going to, deer management and habitat are my two biggest sections. So it's a lot of information coming at you. This is where like, I've been easy so far. It's going to get dense and I'm probably going to confuse myself. So if you need me to slow down or ask questions, please do. So before we even talk about deer management, we kind of have to get like what we're talking about in order in our own heads, and then we have to talk about people management. So most of the time, if people call me about usually deer, but any animal really, but typically deer, they're going to say, well, how many is safe for the environment to hold? And well, how many deer can we have here? How many deer is allowed in this neighborhood? Like that type of question. The honest answer is we don't have an answer for you. So there's usually two things being argued. Some people are thinking biological carrying capacity versus social carrying capacity. So the biological carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals of a species in an environment that the environment can support at that time. It is way difficult to determine because the habitat is constantly changing, especially in those urban areas. They're not closed systems, so we don't have a good actual number that we can give. Seasonality, the number of deer, and habitat all affect the biological carrying capacity. And so there is simply no recommended carrying capacity. The environment will hold what it's going to hold, and if there's too many, you will see the results of that, right? What people are typically calling about is more about their social carrying capacity, and that's the tolerance limit that humans have for a number of individuals within an area over time. So essentially, a community can decide what's an appropriate population is, but it reflects the community's relationship with the deer. It's really not about the deer and the environment, it's about how people feel about the deer. It can be influenced by seeing damage or seeing deer in poor physical condition. It could be a lot of things. If a community is going to talk about biological carrying capacity as a guide, there should be a measurable objective. So that may be less phone calls, maybe it's less browse damage, but there should be something measurable that we can see, like if you're following a management plan, you can see if it's improved your situation or not, and if the plan needs modified. Human management is also tricky. Education alone doesn't work. People need that buy-in and that why. Most people are getting their information from people that they trust and are close to them, so usually, like me, talking at people all day doesn't work. People kind of have their own mind made up of what they want to do. If you're going to talk about management, talk about a call to action or why. So promoting native species, maybe you have a rare orchid that you're trying to protect. developing and actually following a management plan in like the scientific method so you can see if something worked or did not work, advocating for habitat, and adopting no feeding policies. Can you tell I really don't like feeding wildlife? It's probably obvious by now. But if you're going to have a no feeding policy, you should explain why it's harmful to wildlife. There's a lot of research that shows that people know that it's harming wildlife. They're more likely to buy into that. And then if it's also better if you can have a consequence that's enforced. And again, I know that's difficult depending on human hours that you have available and time. Also local ordinances. And then you should manage expectations, because the deer aren't just managed for the hunters, they're not just managed for, you know, the urbanites, it's for everybody. Deer are managed for everyone in Indiana. So having no deer is not realistic, nor should it be the goal. And I think I touched on this last time with the beaver talk, but it holds for almost all wildlife. Wildlife management views are shifting. We've known since 1996 there's been a shift from this domination view of wildlife, which is we treat wildlife how we feel like it, and it does what people say, and that's that. There's a shift towards this mutualistic orientation, which is, you know, they have rights, we gotta care about the environment, and it leads to a decrease in the tolerance of lethal methods of removal. In the past, I've had a lot of places that have just made the decision that they're gonna kill everything. It's within their right, but is it what the community wants? That's where it gets tricky and have to have hard conversations sometimes. Sometimes lethal management is the best option, but it's not always the best option, so we have to think about that. And it's really more complicated than I like deer or don't like deer. It's a lot more built into that. So there's different levels of tolerance for different circumstances, and then your lived experiences influence perception. So Disney. But like things like pets, wildlife interactions, if they cross the line, maybe like all these does are fine, but that buck showed up and rubbed his antlers on my tree and now I'm irritated, right? Sometimes if we have a really nice habitat, people don't expect what we're gonna see, what comes with a pristine habitat. Religious or cultural influences and the media and stories. I'm aware that these, like 3 of the 4 are reindeer, so like I'm aware, but 2 of the 4. But thinking about that, there's family pressures, personal preferences. I've even gone so far, I thought, it stuck out to me, I was in high school, that there's a kid in camouflage overalls with Bambi on the front, and I feel like that was just a very confusing message in a lot of ways, because I was like, I don't know how that was supposed to be, but these are all things that are affecting how people perceive it. And especially in urban areas, how we decide to manage wildlife, that's going to affect trends we see. So when we're selecting, like biologically selecting things, the management decisions in and of themselves are selective pressures. So especially if you have like a city where there's a lot more people, a lot more decisions for, you know, removal or not, that can be its own selective pressure. So we already have wildlife that has increased in nocturnality, increased problem-solving abilities, high intolerance and habituation. I've seen so many videos of deer that are being fed and just walking up and hand-fed and all these things. And so all these things can potentially affect how wildlife's going to behave around an area. And so there's some general things that I would say for any wildlife. So preventing accidental feeding. Most people think of like the intentional, like put out a pile of corn for deer. But thinking about like your garbage cans, pet food, the deer like to eat fruit and vegetables, so it's easy access, bird food, all these things are things that you can do to help prevent feeding wildlife. And then there's also things that you can just do proactively. So don't handle wildlife, we've already talked about that. Covering compost, I think composting is great, but I'm sorry, I might break your one. But if you think about the things we're putting into a compost pile, that may be an attractant. So if you have to, think about covering that, planting habitat. If you don't want your dog to jump a fawn, then supervise your pets when you're outside. Those are things, that's just good dog ownership, right? Or cat ownership. But so there are a couple different types of management. There's non-lethal and lethal management options. So for the non-lethal management options, we have things like reintroducing predators. Probably not going to happen. We haven't done it in how long, we're probably not going to start doing it now. So that's just an unrealistic option. Fencing can be really good, especially for smaller properties and certain crops. It obviously gets difficult with larger properties. Repellents and deterrents, overall I'm getting the vibe that they don't work as well as people want them to. Trapping and relocate is against our policy. It's not really good for the deer. Okay, there we go, maybe. Sorry guys. There we go. When you're trapping deer, deer stress very easily when handled. There's a lot of risks like muscular atrophy, and plus when you're trapping and relocating deer, you're costing anywhere between $400 and $3,000 a deer. It just depends on what you're doing. In plant deer-resistant plants, we will get to that later. Contraception is not approved in Indiana. It's also not effective in wild populations because they're not closed systems. There's also concerns of how you would identify deer that have been treated chemically because you'd have to make hunters aware of that. And then we'd also have to work really heavily with the Office of the Indiana State Chemist for anything like that. Excuse me. And then enforce bans on feeding, really good option. For lethal management, there's sharpshooting, which is going to also be covered under the permit section when I talk about that. Sharpshooting is under a permit. Trapping and euthanasia, for the same reason that we wouldn't trap and relocate, typically we're not trapping and euthanizing. Regulated hunting in the legal season is the best option. And then there's also controlled and managed hunting, which I highly recommend for more urbanized areas. And we will talk about some of these. So, someone can do it, you can do it. For exclusion fencing, for any fencing, before you go, put money into it, think of the cost versus the benefits of protecting the plants or whatever it is you're protecting. What is the length of time you're going to have to, like if it's just, the young plants, what's your length of time that whatever is susceptible to damage? And then, does it need to be permanent or temporary? And then the other thing to think about with fencing is what happens if you have a funnel effect. You get the idea, if I've had calls before well, this whatever animal runs down this corridor because, that's where it is because everybody's got a fence on either side and just created this corridor and you've artificially funneled deer. I've got one lady in South Bend who, she's super nice, but she's the only forested area and everything funnels up her driveway. There's a fence around and everything funnels into her driveway, so that's where all her deer are coming from. Exclusion fences are highly effective. Typically just 2 widths of woven wire. They said minimum of 8 feet. I'm telling you, I would recommend minimum of 10, at least. So that's the hard part, is getting that height. You want to space your posts about 10 to 12 feet apart. It's best for small areas and highly valued crops. Scented fencing. So I know this is a peanut butter fence, but it makes sense that this would be called a scented fence. So it's essentially a modified electric fence. So it's relatively inexpensive. You have to regularly maintain it because you have to make sure that the electric fence is working. It doesn't restrict deer movement, but what it does is you have your post with your electric fence running through, and then about 3 feet high is where you have that electric post. And then over that, you put an attractant, basically. Most people I call it a peanut butter fence for reasons. Taking a piece of aluminum foil, putting peanut butter and shutting that over that fence, so when the deer go to get the peanut butter, they're getting that zap to the nose. So it's a learned behavior that they don't want to be inside that fenced area. I have heard of success of tying flagging on it. You don't see all the colors, but they have that flagging, and ideally that's a learned behavior, so you see that flagging so you don't have to constantly run electricity. I've heard success with that. I haven't seen it, but I've heard. And this is effective for small birds and nurseries, typically about 4-ish acres. So it's a really good option. Everything I can find, most commercial repellents have limited effectiveness at deterring deer because they're not having a learned behavior. There's not like with geese, if you have a repellent, some of those have an actual visual cue, don't eat here, it's bad, and the geese have learned that. You're not having that with these deer repellents. Moisture in the environment can make repellents less effective. Typically, it's very common for them to ignore the repellent and eat the food anyway. You have to be skilled at following a label to apply a chemical, and then you're always going to have constant reapplication. So managed hunting, so I'm going to talk more about hunting, but managed hunting is a little bit more specific. So essentially, managed hunting is everything you would do for the normal hunting season, but you've made it more restricted based on your property needs or your goals. So you still use the legal hunting and all the legal equipment and times and all that, you just get more specific. So, for example, you could choose to have a coordinator look at the properties you're hunting and say, hey, tell us where it's safe to hunt. Tell us where to place hunters. That's the main point of contact. Maybe this person goes to a whole neighborhood and knocks on every door and says, who will or will not allow hunting on their property, who will or will not allow retrieval, those types of things. You can also select your hunters. We had a program for a couple years at Sunset now, but we still have information about managed hunting, essentially where you would, the community would get funding to help hire these coordinators. I said we don't have that program anymore, but it could be like maybe you have a proficiency test, so you have to do certain things and hit a target so many times, and then you can have that hunter out there. You can say, all right, well, while you can hunt bucks here, this site you're only hunting does, right? Something like that. You can also have a team then working to address local ordinances if there's an ordinance about dispatching firearms. It also follows a management plan, and we do have some help available with these. We have the Indiana Private Lands Access Program, which is, I don't run this program, so I gotta make sure I tell you correctly. It basically offers financial incentives to landowners who allow public hunting on their property, because hunting access is a very big limiting factor. But hunting is the most effective, practical, and cost-effective method of deer management. Licensed hunters remove deer that help keep populations healthy, and there's no additional cost to the general public. It is, based on a poll a couple years ago, it is the most preferred method of deer control by Indiana residents. And hunting license sales fund conservation of other programs that benefit wildlife. There's a recreational activity, and it's a healthy food choice. And then the other thing, the biggest thing about hunting, if you have permission to hunt on the property and you're following local ordinances, your right to hunt can't be challenged. The permit can be. We'll get into that a little bit more later, but you have a right to hunt if you have permission and you're following all the local ordinances. You have that right to hunt. I talked about the Pittman Robertson, Denzel Johnson, Wildlife and Sport Fish Restoration Grant. What it is it's not unique to Indiana, so most states get their conservation funding. So essentially, when someone buys a hunting, fishing, or trapping license, based on the number of license sales we have, a portion of that money comes back to Indiana, and that's what gets used for conservation. It's how most people in Fish and Wildlife, it's like 99% how we get our jobs funded. I would recognize, I'm an avid hunter angler, I'm all for it. I recognize that not everyone likes it, and that's okay. The difficulty is that it's the current way that most conservation is set up and funded, is the hunting, fishing, and trapping license sales. So until Indiana and most other states make a shift to do something different, that's where most conservation's happening. And while it's for, deer, usually if you're doing good habitat, you're benefiting a lot of other wildlife, not just deer, not just geese, not just whatever it may be. So now we'll get to the habitat, and I apologize for some of you that came to Beaver Talk. There's probably a lot of overlap, but I mentioned earlier that the #1 reason we're losing wildlife across the planet is because of habitat. So when people call me, a lot of people think, conservation habitat there, like, can't you take them and move them somewhere else? Or I actually had a call from Goshen a couple of years ago. Well, they can develop in the county somewhere, but I don't want them on the river. They don't want to see any habitat on the river because that impedes what they wanted. I was like, well, that's not how it works. But there is a lot of conservation happening. Like, this is there's a lot of cool conservation happening out there, right? But we have urbanization happening, which is where towns and cities grow larger and are formed because more people start living and working in those central areas. So when you have those expanding areas that out there that people want me to take wildlife to is actually closer and closer to here. So that's why you have this conversation about urban conservation. It's not just about wildlife that live in those areas, it's about how the relationships between the wildlife and those people are in areas that are influenced by the built environment. What frequently happens, and we kind of already talked about this, is people who live in urban areas start altering the natural ecosystems thinking, oh, wildlife won't live here, when in reality sometimes they're actually changing it and inviting new or different wildlife in. And that can increase human-wildlife interactions, and they can be either really positive, really negative, and everything in between. Habitat's important because for a period of about 60, 70 years, we lost green spaces in the United States at a rate of 3 million acres per year. It's estimated that 2/3 of the world's population will be in some type of urban area by the year 2050. What's scary to me is 60% has yet to be built by the year 2030. I'm sure if you've seen me talk, I've said this like a million times, but those projections came out in 2018. They've since accelerated, not by much, but they've accelerated. Indiana's urban land cover is expected to double by the year 2040. So that's how quickly and rapidly we're changing these urban environments. And we know we've all probably seen deer in an urban area. I actually found a couple last year sometime. There's actually a dead deer right down on 30 by the Culvers. I was actually kind of surprised to see that here. But they're there, so deer are in urban areas. So we have to think about those habitats. And for those that weren't here for the last time, but what happens is a lot of people expect, state agencies to do something with that habitat. The problem is, so 97% of Indiana is privately owned. So that means not state or federal funded. So in order to work on conservation, we have to start working with the private landowner and getting them to have the buy-in on their own properties. So this is from Indiana land use covered in the 60s. This is in 2001. So this is how drastically we have changed Indiana. Indiana is arguably one of the most physically altered land states. So that's why it's just so imperative that we start talking to private landowners about habitat. And that's why I work with private landowners in my position. If it wasn't already there, I can get my mouse to show up. Almost, the star is right here where we are. So this is March 2005. This is about 11 square miles, by the way. So this is March 2005. Fast forward 10 years, and it's really hard to see, but this pink are all new development or tree thinning or anything like that. And then you fast forward another 10 years. So the pink is from 2005 to 2015. Yellow is 2015 to 2024. So we are still rapidly changing and building in our urban areas. So components of wildlife habitat, what are they? I'll pick one. What are 4 components of wildlife habitat? Water. Food. Shelter. One more. Okay. You guys are pretty good. So water, food, cover, and then space. So you need the space to move from point A to point B, get from point A to point B. If you don't have habitat, you don't have wildlife. If you lose it, they will disappear. If you build it, they will come. But if you manage it, they will stay. Where is the habitat in this picture? Other than lots and lots of food for geese. Or here, there's cover crops, maybe along the riparian area, but otherwise it's just a monoculture. Or where's the habitat? Turf grass is not habitat, it's just grass. So there's a lot of benefits of habitat, and typically you'll probably hear a lot of people talking about wildlife, right? There's habitat, it's a healthy alternative to feeding. It provides us corridors for animals to move from point A to point B for mating and movement and all the other things. It's cover, it's nesting material, but there's actually quite a lot of research into the benefits of native areas for humans. There's a lot of research on improved mental health, decreased risk of heart attacks, things like that by being in the green space. If you plant a tree in the right area, from Carrie Tauscher is the reason I want to plant a tree for my air conditioning. But you can reduce energy needs if you have a tree shaking your air conditioning in the right spot, right? Because I'm about to go with my AC. Privacy, you can use trees and shrubs for privacy fence. Maintenance reduction, because if you plant native, there's usually a lot less maintenance. That's why I plant, because I don't feel like I have the energy to plant my landscape every year. But there's a lot of mixed benefits too. So you have clean water, air, and soil, which both humans and wildlife need, diverse habitat, and all these things which will get carried over to the next slide. So clean air, water, and soil, we all need that. Simple as that. When you have diverse habitat, so let's say, I don't know, some awful disease comes through and wipes out a bunch of landscaping plants, right? But if you plant diversity, maybe one plant dies, but then you have a lot of others still there serving a function in the environment. You're increasing the pollinators, which are the base of almost everybody's food chain. It can help maintain positive human-wildlife interactions. There's a lot of research going on for the troublesome wildlife that may come into our yard. If they have native habitat corridors to go to, they would often prefer those versus your yard where you probably didn't want them anyway. Combating invasive species, and then reducing the heat increases in those urban areas. And the whole idea of this is you have the One Health idea where our health as people is connected to the health of the ecosystem and the environment, and is tied to the health of wildlife. So when we protect all of that, we're protecting ourselves as well. And there's always going to be wildlife that receives direct benefits, especially in the urban areas. So for us, like pollinators, like bees, butterflies, monarchs are really easy to sell. Birds, so raptors, songbirds, small mammals. There's a lot of research being done about herps in those detention ponds. If they're well maintained, they could be a good potential site for herps. And you're always going to have wildlife like deer that receive indirect benefits. They don't really need us, but if they're there, they're going to take advantage of us. So coyotes, deer, foxes, certain birds like robins. And you're never going to have, you're not going, not never, you're not still not likely to invite things like, if we add mountain lions, you're still not likely to invite a mountain lion in because they just don't have a good relationship in urban environments, right? So you're likely still going to have a lot of things, but you're typically not going to have those wildlife that typically avoid humans, bobcats, things like that. So what can we do mimicking nature? So rain gardens, bioswales, native plantings, developing those root systems, creating habitat and tolerating quote-unquote messiness, which that can be really hard in and of itself because I know some areas have these ordinances that tell you to mow every so often. They have noxious weeds, noxious plants, all the things. It is doable to change, but it's very hard. It's a lot of hard work by a lot of really devoted people. If you can minimize turf grass, if all you're doing is mowing it, I know there's people that swear they love mowing, it's not me, but I'm glad some people like it, but maybe thinking about if all you're doing is mowing it, it's not being used for anything else. I loved playing soccer as a kid, I still like it, I don't know if I can play now, but there's a reason to have green spaces, right? They're needed, but if we're just sitting there and just watering and fertilizing and mowing, that's just a waste of time and resources, right? Planning ahead, thinking for all 4 seasons, thinking long term, using the educational signage and pathways to show that habitat is being maintained. This is a lot, and this is probably the main crux of probably why you invited me here. Because, like I said, a lot of people wanted to know what they can do for these deer that have been hit so hard by these diseases. And usually, I think hopefully by now we've talked about urban areas aren't necessarily a wasteland that people think they are. Sometimes they're actually creating more habitat. So in reference to deer, converting a field to some type of suburban development typically isn't habitat loss for deer. Unless you're actually converting that to an absolute biological wasteland, it's really not habitat loss. Deer populations are going to grow to fill the habitat. They're not just going to continuously keep expanding. So that's the biological carrying capacity. At some point, they're not going to keep growing. And we know that populations of deer can be higher in urban and suburban areas because there's a better mix of cover and food compared to quote-unquote more natural areas. So they can get a lot more of the resources in a smaller area. And I think there's some questions like if you have deer in your garden, they're looking for more food. They're not necessarily looking for new food, that's just the food available to them where they are. There's not likely a lot of management practices that can be used to lessen their need to find food where they live. It's just more about how we're going to manage them and what we're going to do to deter them. Also, in general, recreational hunting at the current level isn't going to overall decrease the population. More than anything, it's probably going to keep it steady. It's not going to grow, it's not going to shrink, it's just going to stay the same. It's not true everywhere, but it is typically true, especially in those urban environments. And a lot of people have asked me, well, we need to plant food for them, these cover crops, food plots, food plots, so on and so forth. Honestly, we're Indiana, we have corn and soybeans. We got plenty of food for the deer. They're good on the food. But typically what's happening is that cover is what's lacking, especially that fawning cover, right? So deer actually need those waist-high grasses. They need those native flowers, those native shrubs for cover. Again, they should be native. There's a lot of people that will market commercial grasses that are for deer cover, but they're typically too thick. They're worthless for food for a lot of species, not just deer. And then a lot of times they're invasive. So some of these places that don't know what they're doing, well, maybe they know what they're doing because people are buying them, right? But they're advertising these benefits for deer, and that's not really the case. If you're thinking about fawning cover, if that's what you want to see, so a good test is go to a native planting. This one's in Allen County. Go to a native planting. Look at your planting. Take your hat, or take a basketball. Sorry, basketball for deer. Take a basketball and throw it behind you, and then turn around. If you can immediately see the ball, then it's not good habitat, because that's how the coyote's going to find your fawns too, right? So that's a really good way to think about it. So it's not so much the food. Everyone thinks about the foods. They put out salt blocks, they put out corn, they put out all these things for deer, but really the limiting factor is not food or water. or even the space because they're moving around here, right? It's that cover that they need. So when you're planting native, we typically have plenty of summer food here. In winter is usually when they need more of some of the plants that maybe we're getting rid of. Greenbrier is a really good deer plant. Poison ivy is a good native. It's actually a really beneficial native plant for a lot of wildlife. I am personally not one that gets poison ivy, and I recognize that there's people that get it very easily. I am not one of those people. But if you have, if some people would kill every last bit of poison ivy they have, if it's not an area that's going to affect you or others, maybe leave it be. The other one's Virginia creeper, that easily gets switched, that people get confused with poison ivy. Virginia creeper, while it might not be the thing people want, it's actually a really good native as well. Where there are low densities of deer and plenty of food, they're going to eat those more desirable plants. But if there's less food, obviously it changes. So there's reports, so as we've already talked about, deer will eat any plant if they're pushed to it. There are reports and documentations of deer eating other deer in severe winter circumstances, right? So they will find their food if they have to. And again, native plants are less preferred by deer. They have evolved with deer. So like even if you have a couple plants picked off, they're likely going to handle it because they've grown up with the deer. Again, there's a lot of other benefits to planting native. So I'm not going to spend too much on reading all these here, but if you guys want this, take my email and send me an email, I'll get it to you. This is from an old deer management document we had online. We have an updated one, but it doesn't include these plants, and it's probably because we didn't want to have like, oh, these plants will never be eaten. That's not true, these are just less preferred. So these are preferred plants, so these are trees, shrubs, and vines that are preferred and frequently damaged by deer. And I'd love to highlight that they're barberry, English ivy, rose of Sharon, honeysuckle, calorie bear, all these nasty invasives that we didn't want anyway. Deer like to eat them, so we want to think about what we're planting in our yards. And barberry, so another thing people are worried about is ticks with deer. Barberry is a known arbor of the rodents that carry the ticks that spread the Lyme disease, so cut out your barberry. I do whatever plug I can to get them out. But, so those are things to think about. Less preferred, you have black chokeberry, pawpaw. There are some other non-natives on here too that make it that. They even have a different type of barberry on here. They have Russian olive too, which I wouldn't recommend planting either. But, there's things like sassafras, sweet gum, spice bush. There's a lot of things that we can plant that are less preferred by deer, and you can sometimes still get that year-round color that people want. Again, flowers that are less often damaged, so, milkweed, which we need for the monarchs. We have, foxglove, coneflower, rattlesnake master, golden alexanders, bee balm, all these things that are actually really good for wildlife. And again, none of these lists are comprehensive, but if you want to just send me an email, I'll get them to you. So that will go to rules and regulations real quick. Again, if there is an issue, I would strongly encourage everyone to look at hunting first, hunting the legal season. The average of half an hour before sunrise to half hour of sunset. There's multiple different types of seasons. There's the reduction zone, youth, firearms, archery, muzzleloader, special antler lists. The caveat to all this is, of course, check your current hunting guide. I do not have 25, 26 hunting guide, but I do have the last one, so if you wanted to keep a couple of these and look through what are the typical, they're usually pretty well maintained for the season dates. There's lots of equipment. I like hunting, but I'm also aware in urban areas, some places you can't dispatch firearms, it's just not safe, simple as that. So maybe instead if you couldn't do a shotgun, maybe you could do a crossbow or a compound bow. There's other things to think about with that, but like for example, when we did those chat hunts, a lot of people didn't use firearms, but they also didn't want archery equipment because even though you do everything right and stuff goes wrong when you're deer hunting, so that's why they opted for crossbows for sometimes. So there's ways to look at that. There are deer reduction zones and deer reduction corridors. These are areas where there's higher deer populations and big human density, and the goal is to help have more opportunities to hunt deer that may create conflict. So they have a bag limit in addition to the statewide bag limits. And it's a continuous season from September 15th through January 31st. Elkhart County is partially in a deer reduction zone, but Goshen is not. So the one for Elkhart County is from Highway 31 at the Indiana and Michigan line, down 31 to US 20, east along Highway 20 to County Road 17, and then back up north to the state line. So that's where it is for Elkhart County. Other considerations if you're going to hunt, anyone born after December 31st, 1996 has to have taken a hunter ed course. There are some license exemptions. I think people are not understanding what some of this means, so I'm going to go over that. Resident owners or lessees of farmland who farm that land and their spouses and children living with them. So it's not like, well, my grandpa down the road too. It's whoever is living in the house on the property where the damage is occurring. There is not an acreage requirement, but it should be devoted agricultural land. The other exemptions are youth that are younger than 13, as long as they're accompanied by an adult. There's also some free hunting days for youth as well. The deer license bundle works for all seasons except for the deer reduction zone. For sick or wounded deer, each case is handled individually, but we do not in general, like if you're not going to want to eat or you don't want to harvest it, leave it be. Don't shoot it and then expect another tag for a deer. If you have one that you get, you should definitely be reporting on the sick and dead wildlife report form, which we have. Typically, if it's a minor infection, we're not going to allow hunters to take another deer. It's a minor infection. If there's a systemic infection, we have 3 designated personnel that will look at it and they will determine if you have a license. Also, if a hunter recovered the deer and it's maybe been more than 24 hours, that stuff happens when you don't immediately recover your deer. So typically, if you're not right away recovering it, you're also not going to get another tag for that either. If you are by chance allowed to take another buck, you have to surrender your antlers. So that's something else to consider. I'm putting this in there because I don't have this call a lot, but with the wild deer or the wild cows of Fort Wayne, I'm just going to mention it just in case. But if there's an ear tag, typically they're going to have the letters IN plus another 2 or 3 letters along with 3 numbers to identify them. If you're not sure or if you want to report it, make sure first it's not a pet collar farm tag. I've seen that on here too. But take note of any identifiers, including the color, city and street if possible. We have a permitting biologist who handles all that information. If you shoot one and you find an tag, don't check it in. That's a call to the permitting biologist so that we can void that out. And then if it's a species other than white-tailed deer, which has happened, they're typically privately owned deer and they're considered livestock. So if you get one of those, also don't check it in, contact the permitting biologist and try to keep the heads so we can have it tested and that gets reported up through BOA. There are opportunities for venison donation. It's a very healthy protein, and essentially hunters have the option to donate harvested animals to hunt for hunger, and essentially you're just dropping off that deer to a participating processor, and we have all that information online. The depredation permit is the last resource. Again, the difference is if you get a permit, your permit can be challenged. Your right to hunt can't be challenged, but a permit can be challenged. So we can have a community member saying we're challenging this for whatever reason, go through the legal system. So outside of the legal season, with legal equipment, you need a permit. So that's a sharpshooting permit. That's if a farmer wants to take them off their cropland, any of that, a permit is needed. So you need to contact the district biologist or permitting biologist for a permit request form. We'll send that to you. You can fill that out and send it to the permitting biologist. The permitting biologist will determine if an inspection of your property is needed or not. There's some rules and regulations if it's been so long since you've had an inspection, if you can have one or not. On the permit, it'll tell you the number of deer and what equipment you can use. You have to document a minimum of $500 in damages. If you have browsing or antler rubbing on naturally occurring vegetation that's not planted, that's not considered in the damage estimates. There are considerations for immediate health and safety concerns. You are allowed to keep deer and process it for food on these permits, but any antlers have to be disposed and destroyed. All deer that are removed need to be kept in record, and the permits will not be issued during the legal season. So like, let's say you're in a small part of Elkhart County that is in the deer reduction zone and you start having damage September 15th. Well, because of deer reduction zone season, you're not going to get a permit because there's already a season in that area at that time. And that's not unique to deer. Most wildlife, if it's not in the legal season, you need a permit.
How frequently is this even used?
Pretty frequently.
I was just curious.
Now I don't have all the numbers. I've heavily this year already.
And their crops.
Mostly crops. I have had the case where, this one was really tricky. It was it's not a wine, it's a meadery, like they make ciders and meads.
Huh?
They had damage to their trees. The problem that we had with that situation is there was clearly damage, but there was also apple tree borer, which is something I didn't know was a thing. But deer rubbing can exacerbate the borer, and the borer can exacerbate deer rubbing, so like we don't know which came first. And the damage was happening during the legal season. Plus, if he had a permit, he could shoot, but like one side was like right towards Highway 27, and then the rest was property he didn't own. So like it wasn't really about the permit. There's clearly damage, but like in the right season and where to go. And I think some of us as biologists are like better at having that conversation. Most of the time it's me because I'm in an urban area that I have to think about all those things at the same time. But that's some of the other things. Sometimes it's not really about the permit. We can get you a permit if you insist on it, but like sometimes it's like, but is that going to help you with your situation? So usually that's why I'm like, talk to your, like we were talking, I was like, you should talk to your neighbors about hunting on that property, but see how it goes. It just depends. But yes, they're pretty frequently requested. For Goshen, there's an ordinance about firearms within the city limits. So something to think about here. Reach out to others for past management guidance. Notify enforcement before you're doing your management. Cameras are your friend in urban management. I don't know if you really have that if you're deer hunting in Goshen, but just something to think about. And then stay active in the associations, you know, floating concerns up to the chain, things like that. We have a lot of information on that. That's something that they want to go for. And then I think the last thing I have is resources. We have a lot of stuff on our website about deer. There's probably more that I didn't talk about. We actually have a complete PDF slideshow about abnormal deer in Indiana. So it's basically pictures of some stuff that people think is weird, but it's usually fun. It just looks kind of funky. We have annual whitetail deer reports. I think 2023 is up. They haven't had 24, 25 yet. We have deer management, some of those fencing that I mentioned, some other tactics as well. Information on more of those diseases and links and those dashboards. The district/urban wildlife biologists. The deer reduction zone, deer reduction corridors, general deer information, the Indiana Public Lands Access, landowner habitat assistance, managed hunting, managing human deer conflicts, which is a whole big document that was put on by MAFWA, the Midwest Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. The permitted values, and then we also have the sick and dead animal report. So all that's there, plus more, and then here's my contact information. Please feel free to reach out anytime. And then with that, any questions, comments, screams of dismay, I'd be happy to take them.